and then move it.
Okay. It's in progress. Now finding it may be interesting afterwards, but okay. This week, we thought I was going to have surgery. And so Michael was going to do the Bible study, and it turned out that I didn't have surgery, and it turned out that the subject Michael was going to do is a really good one, but it needs to be a few weeks from now. He's going to kind of summarize where we've been up to this point, I think. Isn't that right, Michael?
Yeah, it's basically it's a rough summary, kind of with answering some specific questions related to what's the difference between the outcome of the Northern Kingdom and what happened with them, and the fact that they became completely lost to history and lost their identity. And what was the difference between that and the Southern Kingdom? And that study is revealing a tremendous amount of information, because there's aspects to prophecy, there's aspects to the Messiah coming, there's other things that are in play as to the reason that Judah was able to maintain their identity. And so we'll talk about that when Skip gets to the final king, and Judah goes into Babylonian captivity. And then when he's done with that, then I'll go ahead and share what I've got, and hopefully it'll be a good discussion.
So as a result, I went ahead and prepared for today, and fortunately for me, maybe not so fortunately for you all, but I ended up with enough information for about 3 Sabbaths, which I like, you know. So we're going to continue on with our study of ancient Judah. Now, last time we discussed the lives of King Manasseh and King Ammon, both terrible kings. But today we're going to begin a discussion of King Josiah. And King Josiah rivals King Hezekiah as being the greatest king to rule the kingdom of Judah. I mean, they were both really, really good kings. They loved God. They obeyed God. They tore down the pagan temples and shrines and all of that stuff. And so I'm going to start with kind of not really a review, but and I'm doing this with these. Oh, and you didn't see this last week, Michael. I'm using your song slides to give us a little bit of background and then the scriptures. So
they look great.
Good. Okay, so we're closing out what we studied last time. Ammon talks about Ammon was 22 when he became king, and he only reigned 2 years. He did evil in the sight of Yahweh, just like his dad Manasseh. But his servants, it doesn't tell us why. Maybe they wanted to worship Yahweh and weren't really able to because of Ammon's acts. So it says the servants of Ammon conspired against him and killed him in his own house. Now, I don't remember. Solomon built a palace for himself, so maybe that's where the king lived. But anyway, but the people of the land didn't like it when they conspired and murdered King Ammon. But they did, and they made his son. Remember, all of the kings in the south, with one exception, and that was the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, who kind of snuck in as the quote king or queen there for a while. All of them are descendants of King David, and so Ammon was a descendant of David, and his son Josiah is also a king, a descendant David. Now, I've been using a harmony of Kings and Chronicles, which has really helped me in my preparation. I hope you all don't mind bouncing back and forth, but that's what we're going to do. So next in 2 Kings verse 22, it talks about Josiah's entry into becoming the king. He was only 8 when he became king, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. Well, obviously he ruled in Jerusalem because he was the king of Judah. It talks about his mother's name, and a lot of times, not 100%, but a lot of times when we see a mother's name mentioned, it's because she was a good mother. And this mother, along with some priests, did a really good job of raising Josiah the right way and teaching him about Yahweh and about God and about the law and so on. It says, and he did what was right in the sight of Yahweh and walked in all the ways of his father David. And he didn't get off the road. If you remember, Blake talked about the way or the road a few weeks ago. He didn't turn to the left or to the right. Now,
I just have to state, my grandson's almost 8, and the idea of an 8-year-old king is just mind blowing. But again, his mother obviously gave him a good stewardship because, man, an 8-year-old king, imagine that.
Yeah, it is difficult, but he apparently had, well, his mother, and then I think there were some priests, but what do they call them, regents or something that helps the king. So we're going to be studying about the great acts of King Josiah. But even with the great changes that Josiah made, and we'll go through a lot of those, here's a pronouncement that God made. Oops. There we go. It says, now before him there was no king like him, who tuned to Yahweh with all his heart, with all his soul, with all his might, according to the law of all the law of Moses, nor any after him. So this is making it very clear that he was a great king. He may have been the greatest king ever. But verse 26 would scare you. Nevertheless, Yahweh did not turn from the fierceness of his great wrath, with which his anger was aroused against Judah, because of Manasseh, who had provoked him. And we, like I say, we went through talking about Manasseh last time. So no matter how good a king Josiah was, God didn't change his mind. Now, Mark made a point of this last time. I thought it was a great point. And that is that it was the people who didn't change. The king can change, but if the people continue to worship Baal or Baal and Aseroth and go to the shrines and all of that kind of stuff, Yahweh's not going to back off.
Well, since you brought this up, because you mentioned it last week and I wasn't able to really pop in, I think you mentioned that Manasseh was feeding his children to Molech, that he slaughtered his children except one. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what I said last week. I do have a little addendum to that, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, no, I just think that ties into what you just mentioned, that Yahweh Elohim is still angry with the people because he was obviously butchering, the children and sacrificing them to Molech, throwing them in fire, because that's what the people, it makes you wonder whether the people were still doing that because of what Manasseh had done. If they were still practicing that, Which brings me to mind, if you were paying any attention this week, the state of Ohio, the voters voted for a constitutional amendment to make abortion at any term is a constitutional right in Ohio, which I think just plays into the idea of, if the saints can pray and turn their heart to God, but if the people themselves are still practicing such wickedness as slaughtering the children and innocents, he's obviously going to remain angry. Anyway, I just thought I'd bring that up since you mentioned
it. Here's another thought, and that is, I think that we've seen lots of confusion about what's going on in this country. I don't mean our confusion, but their confusion. There's lots of evidence that it didn't really matter in certain ways, not always and not all the time. It didn't matter overall that the king did something good or necessarily maybe something evil. What I think that we ought to think about a little bit is, you think about the society and the circumstances that they lived in. They didn't have instant communication. They didn't have TV. They didn't have radio. They couldn't find out what was going on in a different part of the country very easily. So what we're seeing here, I think, that we ought to throw into the mix, is this is a total breakdown of their society. They don't have leadership. They don't have right teaching. And think about that. The Levites were to be scattered throughout the country, and they were to be the ones that people looked to locally for some guidance. And I think we're seeing a systematic failure in all the things and the responsibilities that God originally kind of threw into that society, and the function and how they worked. We see it's not working, and it's got to be not working for a number of different reasons. And so it's kind of a systematic failure, and what we're seeing is representative. What we're reading here is a representative thing of what the king does, and maybe how it affects certain people closely and that kind of thing. So keep that in mind, as I think, as we go through this.
Yeah, those are really good points. As a matter of fact, somewhere in my notes, I have a scripture that says that Josiah removed. I don't remember if it said, we'll get to it later, but I don't remember if it said he removed the Levites or he removed the teachers. But anyway, what you're saying is exactly right, Mark. If it was the Levites, they were teaching the stuff that Manasseh wanted them to teach.
Well, let's think about it in the context of the voting that Michael just talked about in Ohio. So, for decades, we've been thinking, well, this Roe versus Wade decision is kind of bogus, and it's not really in the purview of the Supreme Court. So now that's been overturned by the Supreme Court, that ruling. But now we see, okay, so some thought was, okay, now this is going back to the states where it belongs. And now we see the voters in the states are making a choice. And not just Ohio. I think there's incidents on other local issues, but what do we see? A systematic breakdown in value or an outlook on life. So it's not just the Supreme Court that's making a decision here, because now we see the voters in various states making decisions that we would say is a mistake. But it's kind of a systematic issue going on.
Well, to buttress your point, Mark, you brought up the Levites at this time, that they were to be the teachers of the law. And if you wanted to extrapolate that fact, and obviously that's a systematic breakdown of their society, so too in ours right now, where's the church? If we're supposed to convey the law and the love of God to society, we have a complete societal breakdown right now because we're not informing the people of what the laws of God are and how they're going to affect our society. So you have a commonality. Again, as we study what's happened in ancient Israel, we're seeing that there's a common thread that we're experiencing that they've experienced, although our society and cultures are slightly different.
Yeah. Yeah, well, this country mirrors what we've been studying, for a long time, and we know this country's headed for a downfall. Maybe not next week, maybe not next year, but it's certainly headed for a downfall, and hopefully, not very many other states will vote that way. But California will, New York will. I'm a little surprised at Ohio because I thought Ohio was a more conservative state. But anyway, we'll get off.
Yeah, Texas, for example, is, with a few of the extreme exceptions, has outlawed all abortion in the state of Texas. And I think it's here in Arkansas as well, but I'm not sure. Are you, Skip?
I think that's right.
Yeah, well, Kentucky also, but we just got our rear ends handed to us in the election. The Democrats won hands down over that one issue, which again gets to the point that the people themselves want to destroy their children in the womb because they've somehow bought into the evil belief that it's a constitutional right. So I think we're probably going to see, I think we're going to experience what Judah's experience of just how corrupted the people themselves have become under the rulership of a ruling class that's evil.
Yeah, and one of the differences, at least during Josiah and Hezekiah's reign, is you had a good king, bad people. But when Manasseh and Ammon were reigning, you had bad king, bad people. We've got bad leaders and some bad. Well, I shouldn't say bad people, but anyway, you get the point. Okay.
Well, here's the value of studying all of this, and that is, it's not trying to figure out, well, Jerusalem's like Washington, D.C. Well, in a sense, it might be. But the point is that we see an overall direction. And what happens when people don't dedicate themselves and seek to follow and put the things of God's intent in their own heart and perform it on a daily basis in their own lives. And so that's the value of seeing what's going on. It's confusing. You've brought this up so many times. Well, how does this king have a good son, and then he's so evil, and then the next one is so good, and he has a bad son? It just boggles the mind. And the lesson is, this is what happens when people don't seek to follow their God.
Yeah. And we're seeing this exact thing, laid out. I mean, we're going to have, today's going to be a good day, folks. We're going to talk about a king who sets things right. As a matter of fact, I've got about 3 weeks worth of this good king setting things right. So hopefully you won't be too bored. Okay, so God makes it clear that Manasseh was one of, if not the main cause of Judah's downfall. In verse 26 there, it says, because of all the provocations with which Manasseh had provoked him. But like Mark said last week, and Michael and Mark are both saying now, it's the people that if the people were doing right and they had bad kings, God wouldn't have taken Judah into captivity. But you had both. Anyway, so now let me interrupt Kings for just a minute. Well, we barely got started. I think I've only given you 2 verses. I want to interrupt that for a minute because, you know, as you all know, we've been studying this for a couple of years. I think January of 2022 is when we first started studying about the prophets, which has been almost 2 years ago. But if you look at the time chart, and I don't know if I put it in here or not. I didn't. Dadgummit, shame on me. You will see that there were 3 known prophets at this time, 3 that we know of: Jeremiah, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah. Well, Zephaniah even mentions Josiah in his book, beginning in, I think, the 4th verse, and I've got some of that. And God spoke some pretty strong words through Zephaniah. Now, here's what Expositor's commentary says. The author gave us more information about his ancestry than any other prophet, talking about Zephaniah, tracing his pedigree back 4 generations. Perhaps this was because the good King Hezekiah was his great-grandfather. Okay, so Hezekiah the king was Zephaniah's great-grandfather. Now some say this was a different Hezekiah, but I'm going with that. The time of the prophecy that Zephaniah wrote was during the reign of Josiah, king of Judah. So before focusing his attention on Judah, if you read the first 3 verses of Zephaniah, it's like, whoa, listen to this. I will utterly consume everything from the face of the land, says Yahweh. I will consume man and beast. I will consume the birds of the heavens, the fish of the sea, and the stumbling blocks along with the wicked. I will cut off man from the face of the land, says Yahweh. And you're like, whoa, wait a minute. Why is he saying this? He's about to talk about Josiah. Is he talking about Judah? No. Now, I'll get into that in just a second, but as with many prophets, and I know Mark's mentioned this a couple of times, Zephaniah ends with Yah, a Yah sound. And while some dispute who his ancestors were, one of which was David, Yahweh, his name means Yahweh has hidden, or Yahweh shelters, or Yahweh has hidden. Okay? All right, now, then verse 4, he comes back and he starts talking about Josiah. And Zephaniah shows us that God is very angry with the leaders and the people of Judea. Josiah was trying to repair these problems, but it had just gone too far. Now, let me mention back on verses 1 through 3. Everything I read and reading the verses themselves make it pretty obvious that it's talking about the day of the Lord, way down in the future. I mean, Zephaniah went all the way down to where what the Apostle John saw in vision. He's not talking about Judah when he says, I'm destroying all of mankind, all the birds of the air. I'm destroying. So for whatever reason, Yahweh put it in the writers, or in Zephaniah's mind, to mention the day of the Lord. At least that's what it seems like to me. So then in verse 4, he comes back to the time of Josiah, and he shows us that Yahweh is very angry with the leaders and the people of Judah. And Josiah was trying to repair these problems, but it had just gone too far. Now, Michael, I know you've let him in, but it stayed up on mine, so I'm going to hit it. No biggie. It's no big deal. So Josiah was trying to repair these problems, but it had gone too far. Now, listen to some of the things that Josiah did. Or I'm sorry, that Zephaniah said. I will stretch, verse 4, I will stretch out my hand against Judah and against all the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Now, this is different from what he said in verses 1 through 3. Now he's talking about Judah. I'm going to stretch out my hand against Judah, against the inhabitants of Jerusalem. I'm going to cut off every trace of Baal from this place. The names of the idolatrous priests with the pagan priests. And he's talking about what King Josiah is going to do. Now, this is Yahweh talking through Zephaniah and says, you know, I'm putting a stop to this, and we know how. He did it through Josiah. Then verse 5, those who worship the hosts of heaven, I'm getting rid of them. Those who worship and swear oaths by Yahweh, but also swear by Milcom. And there's an interesting word I'm going to bring up in a minute that I wasn't familiar with. And he says, I'm going to get rid of those who've turned their back from following Yahweh and have not sought Yahweh nor inquired of him. So now, for more than 50 years, during the reigns of his predecessors, apostate conditions had prevailed. Nobody was listening to Yahweh. Nobody was following. Well, nobody. I'm a little hyperbole there. Most of the people weren't following God. It's very obvious from what we're reading. The fall of Samaria in 722 BC had been a reminder of Yahweh's power and his justice. Manasseh and Ammon in the south had remained loyal assets. This is political. They had remained loyal assets or loyal vassals to Assyria, but under this Josiah, the nation of Judah experienced independence. He quit paying Assyria. Now, that got him in trouble with Assyria, but at least he was making efforts. Now, in these scriptures, God announces the eradication of 5 groups: adherents of Baal, idolatrous priests. And remember, this is what we were talking about a while ago. I don't remember if it was Michael or Mark that talked about the Levites, but whoever these are, they're pagan. He got rid of astro worshipers and synchronistic worshipers and apostates. Now, synchronistic means that they've got a foot in both camps. They're worshiping Yahweh, but they're really worshiping the false gods, but they're making it look like they're worshiping Yahweh. Well, God knows the difference. Baal was a Canaanite god of fertility. We all know that. We've dealt with Baal for, golly, almost a year now, I guess. Idolatrous priests, astral worshipers, synchronistic worshipers, and apostates. Baal was a Canaanite god of fertility. Sorry, I read my notes twice. Synchronists are those who mix the worship of Yahweh with the worship of other deities. Now, does that sound familiar with some of what we see today? There's a lot of synchronicity. How about that one for a word? But anyway, he continues God's condemnation of Judah in verse 7. He says, be silent in the presence of Yahweh Elohim, for the day of the Lord is at hand. And this kind of goes back to verse 3, but it also refers to what's going to happen to Judah. For Yahweh has prepared a sacrifice. He's invited his guests. That day, and this is speaking of the day of the Lord, is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of devastation and desolation. a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, a day of trumpet. Isn't that an interesting term? And alarm against the fortified cities and against the high towers. And he's kind of mixing this verse 16 with the day of the Lord and with what's going to happen to Judah. I will bring distress on men. They shall walk like blind men because they've sinned against Yahweh. Their blood shall be poured out like dust and their flesh like refuse. Again, it's kind of a dual, talking about the day of the Lord. He's also talking about some of the things that are going to happen to Judah. Neither their silver nor their gold shall be able to deliver them in the day of Yahweh's wrath. So it tells us again what his main comment is about, the day of the Lord. But the whole land shall be devoured by the fire of his jealousy, for he will make speedy riddance of all those who dwell in the land. Okay, so that's some of what Zephaniah says. If it's only 3 chapters, you might want to go and read Zephaniah. Now, I did not get into Isaiah nor Habakkuk to see what, if anything, they said about what was going on here. I think we know Isaiah did. But now I want to go back to Kings and Chronicles, and remember, I was using a harmony. So I've been, because of the harmony, I was able to take the same comments from Kings that were in Chronicles, but one or the other would fill in blanks that the other one didn't have. So by doing a harmony, you get more information than you would if you only went one of them. So in 2 Kings 22:1, it mentions that Josiah was 8 years old, what Michael's talking about a while ago. And then in verse 3, it jumps 10 years. Now it came to pass in the 18th. Well, what happened in those 10 years? Well, we're going to find out, thanks to the harmony. The authors of Chronicles fills in those years. And it talks about the first act that he did as king was to get rid of the altars and idols. I'm going to show you those scriptures in a minute. But he got rid of the altars and the idols of the pagan worshipers of Judah. He did this during this 10 years. And he had a lot of help. He had good advisors, his mother, the good priests, and so on. And so Josiah or his people passed through the entire nation of Judah geographically and destroyed the areas of Baal worship. And it talks about in the 8th year of his rule, which was 632 BC-ish. Michael loves that word. When he was still young, he was just 16 or 18 years old. He began to seek Yahweh personally. And in his 12th year, he began to purify Judah nationally of the high places and related paganism. So I'm going to jump over to the Chronicles, because like I say, this harmony is just wonderful, because anyway, it makes it easy for me. How about that? For in the 8th year of his reign, while he was still young, he was 16 years old, he began to seek the God of his father David. And in the 12th year, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of the high places. In his 12th year, he was 20. So when he was 20 years old, he knew enough from his advisors and so on to get rid of these things. Now, here's a question. We're going to, or a statement and a question. We're going to find out a little bit later, and I mean, I know everybody already knows this, but we're going to find out in the scriptures a little bit later that they didn't have the book of the law. How did he know to do this? Because he had good teachers. Because they find the book of the law and they go, oh my goodness, we hadn't been keeping Passover or any of this stuff for years. But anyway, so he or his people began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of the high places, wooden images, the Asherah poles, the carved images, the molded images, the idols and things. They broke down the altars of the Baals in his presence. Now, that indicates that he was there a lot of times. He himself went out and saw that this occurred. And they tore down the incense altars, which were above them, and he cut them down. And the wooden images and the carved images and the molded images, he broke in pieces. And this is kind of interesting. He made dust of them and scattered it on the graves of those who had sacrificed to them. Now, a little bit later, I think it may be in Kings, it calls those people the common people. And if you don't have this background, you think, what do you mean common people? You mean, they weren't the royal people? No. What he means by common people, which we will read about that later, it means it's the graves of those who sacrificed to these false gods. He also burned the bones of the priests on their altars. This sounds like they were alive. And he had the priests killed, the evil priests. And he cleansed Judah, and he cleansed Jerusalem. And so he did in the cities of Manasseh, Ephraim, and Simeon. Hey, that's in the north, folks. This is after the northern tribes have been taken into captivity. But Josiah went up into Israel, into the northern area, and he destroyed all these things in Manasseh, Ephraim, and Simeon, and as far as Naphtali, and all around, says with axes. Now, I presume that means that they were killed. But, anyway. And then it says when he had broken down the altars and the wooden images and had beaten the carved images into powder and cut down all the incense altars throughout all the land of Israel, he returned to Jerusalem. So Josiah was out there as a young man of 20, I think. He was making sure all of this got done. Okay. Then it says in the 18th year of his reign. Okay, so he's now 26. In the 18th year of his reign, after he had purged the land and the temple, notice it says he purged the land and the temple, and that, I think the writer of Chronicles here maybe got a little ahead of himself, because we're going to read about the purging of the temple here in a minute. But anyway, it says when he purged the land and the temple, he sent Shaphan, this and Joah, to repair the house of Yahweh, his Elohim. And what was the house of Yahweh, his Elohim? It was Solomon's temple. What had happened to Solomon's temple during the reign of Amon, during the reign of Manasseh? Okay. King Manasseh had done more to desecrate the temple than any other king. King Manasseh built altars to other gods and put them in the courtyards of the temple. And here's another place. I apologize. I should have put a drawing of the of the temple showing the courtyards, but y'all have seen them 1,000 times. Manasseh had built altars to other gods in the very courtyard of the temple. And if you remember, in the outer courtyard, you had the brazen altar where the sacrifices were done, the correct sacrifices, God's sacrifices. And there was also the basin where the priests would wash their hands and cleanse themselves before they went into the outer room in the temple part itself. And Manasseh really made Yahweh angry. He set a carved image of Asherah, the Hittite female goddess, in the house of God. Boy, I tell you what, this guy was really something. And it says the people of Jerusalem have become worse than, now think about this. The people of Jerusalem, God's holy city, the promised land, they had become worse than the nations that were destroyed before the people of Israel. They became worse than the Canaanites. And that's a little hard to swallow. The house of Yahweh, or the temple, was desecrated with all of these images of foreign gods. And King Hezekiah had already destroyed them once, and Manasseh and Ammon went back and put them back. All the work that Hezekiah had done was wiped away by the two kings that followed him. And then Josiah came along. This is what Mark was saying a while ago, and I know I've talked about it several times. You had the father is a terrible king, the son's a great king, followed by two bad kings, followed by one really good king. And it's kind of hard for me to grasp, how this happened, but it's because of these advisors, apparently, mothers, and so on. So now, here's a more complete description from the book of Kings of what I just said. The king commanded, well, I don't know if it's what I just said, but anyway, the king commanded Hilkiah, the high priest. Okay, so Josiah has put the priests, the good priests, the correct priests, back in their positions. He had commanded Hilkiah, the high priest, the priests of the second order, and the doorkeepers to bring out of the temple all of the articles that were made for Baal and Asherah and for all the hosts of heaven. And he burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron and carried their ashes to Bethel. Remember Bethel? Bethel became, under Ahab and other kings of the north, the spot to worship the pagan gods. I mean, it was the biggie. And it was also a spot where Jeroboam had put the golden calf. And so it became, and I remember one of the, it was either one of the kings or one of the prophets used a slang term for Bethel, which means house of God or something like that, and renamed it the house of nothing. I don't know if you all remember that. We talked about that a few weeks ago. We may have talked about it 6 months ago. I don't know. But anyway, verse 5, he removed the idolatrous priests, okay, whom the kings of Judah had ordained to burn incense. So you remember in the north, one of the first things that Jeroboam did was to remove the Levites, to remove the priests, and to put in the people that he wanted, the people who would do what he wanted them to do. Well, the same thing happened in Judah. but we don't really hear about that, or we don't read about that much until we get to this point. It says that Josiah removed the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had ordained to burn incense on the high places in the city of Judah. What kings of Judah? Well, Ahaz, Ammon, Manasseh. They got rid of the true priests and got some men in there that would do anything they wanted them to do. So he got rid of the ones that ordained to burn incense on the high places in the cities of Judah, in the places all around Jerusalem, and those who burned incense to Baal, burned incense to the sun, worshiped the moon, worshiped the constellations, and worshiped the hosts of heaven. And Josiah brought out, or he had the priests bring out the wooden image. This would be the Asherah pole, I'm assuming, from the house of Yahweh, and took it down to the brook Kidron outside Jerusalem and burned it at the brook Kidron. And I apologize, I didn't put a map in here. And ground it to ashes. And this is what I was telling you a minute ago. And threw its ashes on the graves of the common people. I read this first before I read the part about meaning the graves of the people who had worshipped Baal and so on. And that's what it means by the common people. It doesn't mean the non-royals. Okay. And so I'm not gonna tell you what the commentary says because I've already told you. Let's see. Okay. Verse 7. Then he tore down the ritual booths of the perverted persons that were in the house of Yahweh. They had little booths where you could go up and you could it just blows me away. Where women wove hangings for the wooden image, little shrines, if you will. And he brought all the priests of the cities of Judah, and he defiled the high places where the priests had burned incense. He did, we've got a reversal here. We've got where these false priests had defiled the temple. And now the same terminology I thought was interesting, that the good priests, defiled the high places. I thought that was an interesting terminology, where the priests had burned incense from Geba to Beersheba. And he also broke down the high places at the gates, which were at the entrance of the gate of Joshua, the governor of the city, which were left to the left of the city gate. Again, I apologize, no maps. Nevertheless, the priests of the high places did not come up to the altar of Yahweh in Jerusalem, but they ate unleavened bread among their brethren. I'm sorry, I don't know what that means. I mean, I know what eating unleavened bread means, and I don't know, this I don't think was a Passover celebration, but anyway, verse 10. He defiled Topheth, which was one of the false gods, which is in the valley of Hinnom. Okay, everybody familiar with that one? It's what we call Gehenna. It's hell, if you will. It's translated hell in the New Testament incorrectly, or I'm going to go with incorrectly, because it gives you a false understanding of what hell is. The Valley of Hinnom, as I think everybody knows, was a trash dump, and they burned it continually. It was an ever-burning fire, if you will. And so traditional Christianity has taken this Valley of Hinnom to symbolize an ever-burning hell where non-Christians, if you will, are going to be thrown and tortured forever. And sorry, that's not what that word means. The word Gehenna means Valley of Hinnom. It's a valley outside of Jerusalem that had an ever-burning fire. So anyway, I'm sorry, I can't help myself when I run into that word. He did it, and this is what Michael mentioned a while ago. He defiled Topheth, and he destroyed what was going on in the Valley of Hinnom, in Gehenna, that no man might make his son or his daughter pass through the fire to Molech. And Michael mentioned that a while ago. They were doing human sacrifice. The people of God in Judah, just outside of the city of Jerusalem, were sacrificing probably firstborn children or a child to, because it wasn't raining or whatever the situation is. Then he went on, he removed the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun. Now, this was kind of interesting. Nothing wrong with the horses, but it kind of reminds me of, you shouldn't eat bread, meat sacrificed to idols in front of people that it might bother. And I think that's what's happening here. The people knew that the horses had been dedicated to the sun, so they were removed. Then he removed the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun at the entrance of the house of Yahweh by the chamber of Nathan Melech. I don't know if that's, he was an officer of the court, and he burned the chariots that had been used in the worship of the sun. Yeah.
I was going to say, while you're on the subject, these chariots dedicated to the sun, if memory serves me correctly, maybe Mark would know, this would indicate, we talk about Molech in verse 10. In verse 11, I think this is a different god. This would be Egyptian, I would almost think, because the Egyptians were the ones that were notoriously, their main god was Ra, the sun god. I'm not familiar with other Canaanite gods that were of the worship of the sun. I don't know how germane that is to the discussion, but I just find it interesting. Now we have other gods involved in worship at the temple here, not just Molech, but we might have Egyptian gods being brought into the temple here.
Okay, you're probably right.
Well, the worship of the sun was widespread. So I was just reading something from the Expositor's Bible Dictionary, and it just, in this section, it says that the solar cultus was widespread in the ancient Near East. So, but you're absolutely correct. It was a big deal in Egypt, but it was also pervasive all around the area.
But the reason I ask is my biblical history is probably fuzzy. It's just been a long time, till we got started in this study. A year and a half or almost 2 years now. Didn't Judah make petitions to have Egypt help them out against Assyria? Was that during or before the time of Josiah that they were asking for help?
Yes, and remember, who was it was the king of Assyria, I think, wasn't it, that said, Egypt is so weak, if you put your hand on a twig, it'll penetrate your hand. You remember that? I can't remember.
Yeah, I do. Okay, maybe that's where the memory came from. It was part of a previous study where the king of Assyria was ridiculing and taunting Judah for turning to Egypt for help. So maybe that's where verse 11 comes in, that they were adopting the Egyptian gods in order to get along to ask for their help against the king of Assyria after the northern tribes fell.
That fits because Egypt had chariots, and that gives you extra power against somebody else. So I think that really fits.
Yeah. Okay. Verse 12 is kind of interesting. The altars that were on the roof. Really? Of course, they had flat roofs back then. The altars that were on the roof, the upper chamber of Ahaz. Remember Ahaz, King Ahaz? He was terrible. He's like a grandfather of Josiah, maybe a great grandfather or whatever. But they named part of the palace, the chamber of Ahaz. But anyway, the altars that were on the roof, the upper chamber of Ahaz, which the kings of Judah had made, they destroyed. And the altars which Manasseh had made in the two courts of the house of Yahweh. Remember the two courts were, again, I apologize for not putting a drawing of the entire temple area. But anyway, had made in the two courts of the house of Yahweh. The king broke down and he pulverized them and threw their dust into the brook Kidron. Then, this is a long section, and it talks about the many things that Josiah did to rid the country of pagan worship. That's why I'm going through all of this, because it's just verse after verse after verse after verse of things that King Josiah did to rid the country of all of this stuff. And remember the scripture I read earlier that Yahweh said, yeah, Josiah, you did a good job, but sorry, man, the people have done so wrong.
Skip.
Yeah, Jim.
Verse 13 kind of indicates that some of this stuff had been there from the time of Solomon and not destroyed at any time before this.
Yep.
That's
for his wives, remember?
Yeah, and he did it for his wives. But the thing is that all of the kings of Judah up until this one had left that asterisk there.
Yeah, but let me throw a however in there. Hezekiah tore down a bunch of that stuff, and Manasseh rebuilt it. So
it may have been the rebuild.
It may be the rebuild. I do not know. I'm just giving you that option.
I'll take it.
So then Josiah defiled the high place. I love the way that they say he defiled the defiled, which I guess is another way to say it. But he defiled the high places that were east of Jerusalem, which were on the south of the Mount of Corruption, which Solomon, king of Israel, had built for Asheroth. And I think, Jim, this comes back to you. I think maybe, you're absolutely right that they've been there all along. Now, it could be that Hezekiah turned them down, but I don't know. This kind of sounds like they were there. But Solomon had built for Asheroth, Ashtoreth, the abomination of the Sidonians. So he had a wife from Sidon. Yeah.
Here's a quote. Hold on a second. Let me get this place. Lost my spot. What verse are you in there? Verse 13. 13.
It's 2 Kings.
Okay. 1 Kings 11:7. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. And I would suggest that apparently these weren't torn down, but there are places where we've read it said that the king did this, he tore down everything except and the high places. Well, this was a high place. It was on a mountain east of Jerusalem. That's a high place. So, these things were pervasive. They were, this is part of that idea. I think we have to realize that the corruption was systematic. And when it said that the king tore down this and did that and the other, it looks like Josiah was much more complete in what he did than had been done, even though things had been done. Corrections had been made, but not everything was corrected. These altars on the roofs were probably official altars on the roofs, but I could see that various places who had roofs and who wanted to worship the host of heaven, which means, completely, it means anything that was representative of the Elohim, that people looked up into the heavens and saw the stars, and they were symbolic of all the host of heaven, all those unseen Elohim that were represented by stars.
Yeah. It's exactly the same spot that you just read about back in First Kings. Built for the same gods and so on. And Milcom, I think, is the same as Molech. And and it even says it there: Milcom, the abomination of the people of Ammon. And what you read said Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. So, okay, so he broke in pieces the sacred pillars, cut down the wooden images, and filled their places with the bones of men. Now, were these men that were alive, and now are no longer alive, that he killed because they, we don't know. But anyway, moreover, the altar that was at Bethel, and this is the one that Jeroboam built, the altar that was at Bethel, and the high place which Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel sin, had made, both that altar and the high place Josiah broke down. And he burned the high place and crushed it with powder, to powder, and burned the wooden image. Verse 16. As Josiah turned, so he's out there, and he turned and he saw the tombs that were there on the mountain. Now, I think this goes back to Elijah. Okay. Anyway, says he sent and took the bones out of the tombs and burned them on the altar and defiled it according to the word of the Lord, which the man of God proclaimed, who proclaimed these words. And then he said, what gravestone is this that I see? So the men of the city told him, well, and you all, I'm sure, will remember, it's the tomb of the man of God who came from Judah and proclaimed these things which you have done against the altar of Bethel. You remember that story? The king Jeroboam said, seize that man, and his arm froze. And then he said, please, would you ask Yahweh to unfreeze my arm? And he did. But God had told him, I want you to go straight home. Don't stop and eat with anybody. You all should, I'm sure you remember this story. And Josiah said, let him alone. Don't move his bones. We're not going to move his bones into where these pagan bones, I'll call them pagan bones. So they let his bones alone with the bones of the prophet who came from Samaria. And you remember that story. Now verse 19, more about what Josiah did.
First
Yeah.
Kings, that's in 1 Kings 13.
Okay, do you have it?
I can read part of it. Let's
Okay.
see. Behold, a man of God came out of Judah by the word of Yahweh to Bethel. Jeroboam was standing by the altar to make offerings, and the man cried against the altar by the word of Yahweh and said, O altar, altar, thus says Yahweh, behold, a son shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name, and he shall sacrifice on you the priests of the high places who make offerings on you, and human bones shall be burned on you. He gave a sign the same day, saying, This is the sign Yahweh has spoken. The altar shall be torn down, and the ashes that are on it shall be poured out. And when the king heard the saying of the man of God, he cried out, which he cried out. Jeroboam stretched out his hand, saying, Seize him. Stretched it out, he dried up, and could not draw it back to himself. So that's the original account, what happened in 1 Kings 13 through 13:1 through 14:16 is the whole account of what took place.
That it's so interesting to go back and think about and to read a prophecy that was made a long time earlier that is we're watching being fulfilled as we read in Chronicles or Kings, wherever we are. I think that's great. Thank you, Mark. Verse 19. Okay. More about what Josiah did. I mean, this guy was busy. Josiah also took away all the shrines of the high places that were in the cities of Samaria. Note that we're in the cities of Samaria. That's way north. That's the capital of Israel. Well, guess what? They're all gone. There were, there was a remnant, and the remnant came down. Some of the remnant came down to live in Judah. Some of the remnant stayed in Israel. But he took away the shrines of the high places that were all the way up in Samaria, which the kings of Israel had made to provoke Yahweh to anger. Think Ahab. And he did to them according to all the deeds he had done in Bethel that Mark just read about. Well, no, that's not where that was. But anyway, he executed all the priests of the high places who were there, who were where? Who were still up in Israel. And he executed them on the altars, burned men's bones on them, and then he returned to Jerusalem. So Josiah's out and about. He's not just telling people to do this. He's going and making sure it's being done. Then the king commanded all the people, saying, keep the Passover to Yahweh your God, as it is written in this book of the covenant. Now, I've kind of jumped the gun here. In organizing this, I've jumped in front of where I meant to be, and I'm trying to think. Here, just a second.
Well, while you're thinking, can I just pop back to verse 10, where he desecrated Topheth, which was in the valley of Ben Hinnom, so nobody could use it to sacrifice their son or daughter in the fire to Molech. And I just was glancing back at that and I thought, you know, how do they dispose of aborted fetuses? And did you know they burn them today?
Oh, they do.
I looked that up just then when I thought that's interesting, you know, because we've always kind of tried to make a modern day equivalent to, you know, burning your children in the fire to Moloch. And it suddenly crossed my mind that I'd never thought about what they do with the fetuses, but I ran across an article that's, you know, in Live Science or whatever, why are aborted fetuses burned? And you know, and it has an article about people being outraged over the news that aborted fetuses were routinely burned at an incinerator in Oregon that was used medical waste to generate electricity. So yeah, I'm not sure. Why do you think they want us to use more electric cars? So, but I hadn't thought about it. And so when I looked that up, I was shocked. I mean, something in the back of my mind thought, I wonder if they do cremate them, because there's all this emphasis on things being ground to dust and being burned up in the section we're reading right now. And apparently they incinerate what they consider medical waste. And I thought that was an interesting comparison to what was done. You know, I mean, we don't know what burning their children in the fire to Molech meant, but it just was an interesting equivalency to me. That's all.
It is, good point. Good. Okay, now I've had to apologize several times today, and I'll apologize again. I think I got some of this a little bit out of order, but that's okay. All right, so it mentions this about the Passover. So now I want to go into, you know, how they found out about it, because they didn't know about it. So I should have stopped at verse 20, but didn't. That's okay. So they raised money to pay workers for them repairing the temple. And the survivors of the northern tribes, specifically from Manasseh and Ephraim, two of the tribes, not Manasseh the king, Manasseh the family, and they collected funds to be used to repair the temple, and gave that money to the Levites, because the Levites were in charge of preparing the temple. And so in 2 Chronicles 34:9, it says when they came to Hilkiah the high priest, they being, you know, the ones doing the work, they delivered the money. I'm sorry, they had gone up to Israel. They delivered the money that was brought into the house of Yahweh, which the Levites who kept the doors had gathered from the land of Manasseh and Ephraim and from the remnant of Israel and so on. And, you know, so they brought this money that they had collected back to Jerusalem and gave it to the foreman who had the oversight of the house. Now, as I go through this, I want you to think the Congress of the United States. There are people in the Congress of the United States, okay? So here's this money that was raised, and they put it in the hand of the foreman who had oversight of the house of the Lord. Sorry, I had to emphasize that. And they gave it to the workmen who worked in the house of Yahweh to repair and restore the house. And now I'm kind of trying to make a metaphor out of this, comparing it to, or analogy, comparing it to our own leaders today. They gave this money to the craftsmen, to the builders, to go out and buy hewn stone and timber and beams to put floor in the houses, which the kings of Judah had destroyed. Okay, and here's why I wanted you all to think of Congress, because this is something that doesn't happen. However, there was no need for an accounting to be made of the money they delivered, because they deal faithfully. Does that remind you kind of the opposite? That's what's going on today. And in Chronicles 34, it says, and the men did the work faithfully. They're overseers. So sorry. Okay. I know I've gotten too political, so sorry about that. The overseers were these guys, and they were Israelites, and he mentions families, and they were supervising the repairing of the temple. Why did they have to repair the temple? Because the previous kings had damaged it greatly, and also some of the gold was taken out of the temple years before to pay the Assyrians, or to pay the Syrians, or to pay the Egyptians to either help us or please don't fight us, or whatever. And then it talks about others of the Levites that were skillful with instruments of music. Now, I don't know if what it's saying is that, like us, when we're doing a job, a lot of us like to have music played in the background while we're working. Sounds like that may have been what was going on. And they were over the burden bearers, and they were overseers of all who did work in any kind of service. And some of the Levites were scribes, some of them were officers, and some of them were gatekeepers. Well, during the reigns of Manasseh and Ammon and Ahaz, the temple was being used for pagan worship and not for the worship of Yahweh. So some very important books had been forgotten. They didn't care. And so this book that was found, by the way, many commentators believe that it was the book of Deuteronomy. Now, it doesn't mean it was only the book of Deuteronomy, but it was specifically the book of Deuteronomy. Here's what Expositor's commentary says. The book thus was at the least the book of Deuteronomy. It is called the covenant back in Deuteronomy 29, for example. And it contained the curses. We've talked about them many times. In Deuteronomy 28, it alone called for a central sanctuary that was stored at the temple, usually by the side of the ark. Now I'm reading this from Expositors. The book that was found seems to have become misplaced during the apostate administrations of the previous kings. Well, yeah, they were going in there, putting up pagan altars, putting up the pole of Asherah, putting up, they were doing all that stuff. So, here's a bunch of old books. Let's throw them in the corner. And Manasseh and Ammon were two of the kings that did that, under whom the ark had been moved about before the temple was built. And I think all it's talking about there is that every time Israel moved somewhere, the ark had to be moved, and it wasn't put in a permanent location, semi-permanent, until the temple was built. But here's another thing that the Bible Knowledge Commentary said. In the course of paying out some of the temple money one day, Hilkiah, the high priest, found a copy of the book of the law of the Lord. Because of certain higher critical assumptions, many scholars limit this document to Deuteronomy. Well, I'm not sure why they do, but they do. But the Bible Knowledge Commentary goes on and says, well, there's no reason to do that. But Deuteronomy may have been in mind in certain places in this narrative. The book may well have included the entire Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. in either case, doesn't really matter. The book had been lost for many years. And, lost may be the wrong word to use there. It could be hidden. And then they forgot about it. And there was much excitement when it was read. 2 Chronicles 34:14. Now, when they brought out the money that was brought into the house of Yahweh, Hilkiah the priest found the book of the law. And I don't know how those two events are connected, but that's what it says. But Hilkiah, who was the high priest, he found this book of the law of the Lord that was given by Moses, that was written by Moses. Then Hilkiah the high priest said, now notice part of this is from Chronicles, part of it is from Kings. Then Hilkiah the high priest said to Japhan, look what I have found. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, and he read it. So, they're up in the temple. They find the book, and these two guys go to the trouble, if you will, to read the book while they're there in the temple. Now, in 2 Chronicles 34:18, it says, then Shaphan, the scribe, told the king, hey, Josiah, guess what? Hilkiah gave me a book, and I read it, or I'm going to read it to you. Thus it happened, when the king heard the words of the law, that he tore his clothes. And we know that's a sign of humility and oh my goodness. Verse 20. Then the king commanded, and he said in verse 21, go and inquire of Yahweh for me and for those who are left in Israel in the north and Judah concerning the words of the book that's been found. For great is the wrath of Yahweh that's poured out on us. We've already heard the prophecy from Zephaniah because our fathers didn't keep the word of Yahweh to do according to what's written in this book. So the king had an immediate reaction. He ripped his clothes, a sign of contrition. He sent a commission made of trusted officials, along with the high priest Hilkiah, and this is what in the world? Okay. I don't know what's going. Oh, my paper, my notes are on. Let me find where I am. My notes were on my keyboard, and they were changing the keyboard. He rent his clothes, and here's what he did. He sent these guys to a prophetess. I can't help but find this to be very, very interesting because he had Isaiah, he had Zephaniah, and he had Habakkuk that he could have sent those men to. He didn't. So Hilkiah and those the king had appointed went to Huldah the prophetess. Oh my goodness. What would we say today if instead of sending the people to a great preacher, we sent them to a woman? I just find this wasn't so sad. It is hilarious. It really is. But anyway, so they came to this female prophetess, and they spoke to her, and she told them, "Here's what God has said to me to tell you. Thus says Yahweh Elohim of Israel, tell the man who sent you to me." Now, who was that? Josiah. Well, it could have been, one of the priests, but basically it's Josiah. It goes back to his feet. Thus says Yahweh. Hey, sorry guys, I'm going to bring calamity on this place and on its inhabitants, and all the curses that are written in the book, which they have read before the king of Judah, because they've forsaken me and burnt incense to other gods. And here it's not just talking about the leaders, it's talking about the people also, that they might provoke me to anger. They did this just to provoke me to anger. And I can't help but think that when they did it to provoke him to anger, they didn't really believe that he existed, or he was one of the little g's, the little g gods. And that's just me talking. But anyway, because they've forsaken me and burned incense to other gods, that they might provoke me to anger with all the works of their hands. Therefore, God says, my wrath will be poured out on this place, Judah, and not be quenched. Ouch. Verse 26. But as for the king of Judah, Josiah, who sent you to inquire of Yahweh in this manner, here's what I want you to tell him. Thus says Yahweh Elohim of Israel, concerning the words which you've heard. And she's saying this, it's coming from God through her to these men to tell this to Josiah. Because your heart was tender and you humbled yourself before Yahweh. Okay, that's fine. When you heard his words against this place and against its inhabitants, in other words, when you read it in the book that's been hidden for years, and you humbled yourself before me, even though I'm going to destroy this nation, you tore your clothes and you wept before me. I heard you. I understand how dedicated you are, says Yahweh. Surely I will gather you to your fathers, and you shall be gathered to your grave in peace. In other words, you're going to die before all this bad stuff happens to Judah. And your eyes are not going to see all the calamity which I will bring on this place and its inhabitants. So they brought this message back to the king. Now, this is where I'm going to stop, but I want to say one more thing here. Josiah would be buried in peace. He would not see the disastrous fall of Judah, which is the point that Huldah is making here. But though he was buried in honor, he died in battle. He died violently. But he didn't see what was going to happen to his nation, because he had done so much to fix things. And God said, you've done all of this. I'm not gonna make you watch what happens to your nation, and I'm not gonna make you go into captivity into Babylon. We find out later on. So I'm gonna stop here, because I've got a whole bunch more. So next week I'll have my arm in some kind of contraption, but I think I'll be able to do the Bible study. Some of you may go, oh, shoot, why couldn't somebody else? Anyway. All right.
Hey, Skip.
Yeah, Mark.
I'm glad you brought that up about the question of did it, finding the book of the law, was it the whole Torah, or was it Deuteronomy? And I'd never really examined and thought about that. But, you know, it's interesting to note that that Deuteronomy is the restatement of the covenant and a new covenant with the people as they stood on the plains of Moab waiting to go into the promised land. And chapter 28 is the blessings and cursings chapter. In chapter 29 of Deuteronomy, I'm speaking of Deuteronomy, chapter 29 starts out and says, can you easily turn to that in on your desktop? Or
Yeah. We're going to Deuteronomy.
I think Deuteronomy 29.
Okay. Hang on.
I think that there is a correlation that would point to that and emphasizes what you're going through here in this section that you just went through.
All right. In particular translations that matter?
It doesn't really matter, I don't guess. If you've got the new English translation, that's fine. If
I've got New King James. If you
that's fine, that's fine.
All right. Can you all there? You all ought to be able to see that.
So notice it says, these are the words of the covenant which Yahweh commanded Moses to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant which he made for them in Horeb, which is Mount Sinai. And then there's this testimony. You've seen everything that God did to Egypt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you read through this, which I would think would be a good thing to do, because you can see the likeness of it with regard to what Skip just read and covered. He said in verse 14, I make this covenant and this oath not with you alone, but with him who stands here with us today before Yahweh, as well as with him who is not here today. So does that extend down to these people? I think it does, hundreds of years later. And it talks about Egypt, verse 17, you saw their abominations and their idols, which were among them, so that, verse 18, you may not be, so that there may not be among you man or woman, or family or tribe, whose heart turns away today from Yahweh, our Elohim, to go and serve other gods, the gods of these nations, so that there may not be among you a root bearing bitterness or wormwood. And that's the story that we've been looking at about Israel and Judah, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
And if you read on down, like verse 26, for they went out and served other gods, worshiped them, and they didn't know that he had not given them to them. Then the anger of Yahweh was aroused against this land to bring on it every curse that is written in the book. He uprooted them from their land in anger and wrath and great indignation, cast them into another land. So, you know, it seems to be exactly what Chronicles is talking about and this account with Josiah. And, you know, the picture is kind of a summary of disloyalty by these people after Moses and in this history, this disloyalty to Yahweh, their Elohim, and what was going to happen. I think so. In my mind, it seems like, you know, somebody in the priestly troop hid the book of Deuteronomy so that they wouldn't be convicted. I went back and looked at Leviticus 26, which is also it's a a blessings and cursings chapter, but it does not have the connection to a new covenant or to an additional covenant before they went into the land of promise. And with all these things that were convicting them as they went into the land, that they needed to have a heart to turn to God. Otherwise, they're going to be cast out of the land. And, it all is pointing to disloyalty to Yahweh, which I think is the summation of what happened in what we're reading in Kings and Chronicles. That's it.
I was going to comment on what you're talking about in that chapter, which is one of the most fascinating chapters in all Deuteronomy. But verse 4 says, verse 3 says, your eyes have seen the great trials, the signs, and those great miracles, but yet the Lord your God has not given you a heart to perceive, and eyes to see, and ears to hear unto this day. That's puzzling to me. What does that mean?
That's interesting, Ken.
Well, I think you get eyes to hear and eyes to see, ears to hear, because you are humbled and seek God. And it kind of is a symbiosis, a symbiotic relationship. As a person turns to God, God turns to them. And he may bring about trials. In fact, that's exactly what the prophets are about. They're telling people these trials, if you will turn, they're supposed to make you turn to God. And if you don't, this message is repeated, if you don't humble yourself before God and seek him, then, you're not going to have that eyes to see and ears to hear. That's the way I look at it.
Is it? Yeah, that makes sense too. But the fact that it says he has not given you a heart to see, is it something to do with the difference between the modified or the covenant that we now have available that they didn't have, the free search for the Spirit that they didn't have available? It was given obviously to other people. There's many occurrences when the Holy Spirit was certain people were filled with the Holy Spirit, given the Holy Spirit. But it seems like in the new covenant, it's more readily available for those to seek it, to achieve it, where it wasn't available to them like it is to us, perhaps. That just a thought.
I wonder. Okay, the word Deuteronomy, I believe, translates into second law. Is that correct?
Yes, from what I understand.
Okay, all right. So he says, yet Yahweh has not given you a heart to perceive and eyes to see and hear. Okay. Up till now, to this very day. Now, listen to what I'm about to say. Now, I don't know, Ken. It may be showing the difference, as you say, between, those of us today who have the Holy Spirit and they didn't. But I'm just wondering if he's not saying, okay, you guys didn't listen to me. And so Yahweh hadn't given you a heart to perceive till now.
Yeah. Maybe it's also because of all the things that they did, and it was obvious to him at that point that they were never going to be able to fully convert and fully leave their old ways, that he blocked their ways, but yet allowed it to be open to the younger generation that did go into to cross the Jordan. Maybe that was his way of, okay, as we know, Moses wasn't allowed to cross over.
Yeah.
So maybe that was just look, your time's not now. Your time will come in the resurrection. So and as a mercy, I'm blocking you from getting the full measure of what we're doing here and what I'm doing.
I don't think that that's the message. I don't see that. I think that this is a message about being loyal to God. It's not a message that we would interpret to ourselves like you're going to receive the Holy Spirit. This is a message about being loyal to God, to have Him as your object of worship. I mean, people are able to show loyalty to the nth degree in circumstances today, loyalty to their country, loyalty to the military, loyalty to a lot of different ways, and we would never ever count them as being converted individuals in the typical sense. But I think the message of this book and this message, the message of Deuteronomy, the message of the blessings and cursings, the message of Deuteronomy 29 is, who are you going to be loyal to? This is a message that God gave that David David did, as I mentioned last week or the week before, heinous things, terrible things. We would count him as a person who was unconverted. He plotted the death of his good friend and military comrade Uriah, committed adultery with his wife, had a baby born out of wedlock, was called by God a man of war, and yet he was a man after God's own heart. What's that mean? I think it means that he was, even with his human failures, terrible, bad things that were not good, he never turned to another God.
Yeah, but okay, I agree with all of that, but I think the point Ken was making, and I think it's an interesting and valid point, because there in Deuteronomy 29, right before the little section that Ken read about that said, to this day the Lord has not given you a mind that understands or eyes that see. If you go back to verse 2, it says, your eyes have seen all that the Lord did to Egypt in Egypt to Pharaoh. Verse 3, and with your own eyes you saw those great trials, those signs and wonders. And then what Ken read, but to this day the Lord has not given you a mind that understands, or eyes that see, or ears that hear. So, and I do think there's a contrast being made there, that you, with your own eyes, you saw those things, but at that point in time, it says that God did not give them eyes that see and ears that hear. In other words, that while you saw it with your own eyes, you did not have a heart to comprehend what it was that you saw. And I think that contrast is being made there, that there is an implication that something in them was lacking, that while they saw those things, the depth of meaning, they were not given that depth of understanding to fully understand what that meant. So aside from Mark's point about loyalty to God, which is the underlying key of the covenant, I think Ken has a valid point that this does seem to be a difference between, their own eyes that saw those things and the eyes to understand, the heart to understand that God says at that point, for whatever reason, it said he hadn't given to them. So does that address more of what your question was, Ken? Because I would have a similar kind of response to you.
Yeah, you said it very well. That's exactly my sentiments. You said it and that's exactly what I was thinking. And as you were saying that, I was also comparing what happened with Pharaoh. Pharaoh saw these miraculous miracles, and God says several times he hardened his heart so that he wouldn't repent, so that he could fulfill the plan that he had already in place. So, and now I'm not saying that comparing these people to Pharaoh, but the circumstances, the things they saw, the things Pharaoh saw. Pharaoh, at points in that story, seemed to be like, okay, I'm gonna give in. But then no, he doesn't. And so, but it had to happen that way. So all the things that God had planned to happen had to happen. And they were there for an example for us to learn from. And so
yes,
so similar there.
I think we can build on that in that I've been listening to Jordan Peterson's series of discussions on the book of Exodus, and they were talking about the very concept of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. And, when you look in scripture, it says that God would, that it takes an act of God to, when he says, I will change your heart. I will give you a heart of flesh instead of a heart of stone. So the implication seems to be that often by ourselves, we would not make those good choices, nor would we properly understand what it is that God is doing. We would not see God in the way that he wants us to. And the point they made in this discussion with Jordan Peterson was that God stepped back and allowed Pharaoh to be the person, the human that he was, and make the decision to be stubborn and resist what he was being asked to do for the Israelites. And that the contrast is, left to ourselves, we will have a hard heart. We will have eyes that don't see. We will have a heart that doesn't understand. And it's only when God gives you those eyes to see and gives you that heart of flesh instead of a heart of stone. And so I thought it was a very interesting point they made, that God did not harden Pharaoh's heart. He simply stepped back and did not intervene. He let Pharaoh take over with his own humanity. And that was what made, because he had a heart of stone. And so he made the decisions that God intended to be made. In other words, God didn't change it. He let the events unfold just the way that they were going to, because it appears that outside of God intervening and giving you that softer heart and those eyes that see, you will not understand just as a human, if that explains anything.
Hey. Okay, those are interesting points. Hey, quit. Come on. My dog's going crazy in here. Get out of here. She wants to play. Okay, anything else? I know today was just, oh great, Skip's going to read 1,000 scriptures. That's going to be real exciting. But I think reading about the stuff that Josiah did, I mean, what a great king. All the stuff that he did and all of the okay, sorry. Anyway, we've got more. I'm assuming that I will feel fine next week. So we will continue talking about Josiah. There's more. So anybody else?
Hoping that, I'm hoping what you explain for us next week is when we step into the section where they keep the Passover,
Yep.
And it tells how they brought 30,000 lambs and goats and 3,000 cattle, and other people gave 5,000 Passover offerings and 500 head of cattle. I want to know how you're going to break that down and explain to us that the priests managed to get all of those killed before sundown on that day. Can you do that?
Thanks. Gee, thanks. Gee,
What?
I don't know that I'm going to go that route because I can see a trap.
Well,
Well, I was just reading how many things were brought to be offered as burnt offerings and sacrifices and whatever, and it just says they roasted them all and they did it all. The entire service was carried out, and they did it all before the evening or whatever it was. And I'm thinking, how did they? How in that space where they were supposed to sacrifice them, logistically, how do we get all that number of animals sacrificed? So I'm hoping you'll have a nice explanation for us.
Yeah.
yeah, Skip, just look up how they do a giant Texas barbecue at the state fair, and there's your answer.
I think they spatchcocked them all.
Sure.
That's twice the work.
Yep. I spatchcocked a chicken last night. Anyway.
I have no idea what that is.
How long did that take you? It's you split it down the middle and spread it open into in kind of
you cut the backbone out, and then you turn it over and you smush it down so that the chicken lays flat and cooks, pretty evenly. And that's one of the things I like about doing it that way, by the way, is that we get about 8 meals out of it for $7. It's pretty cheap. Pretty cheap. So, okay. All right. Anybody else before I get off into chicken recipes?
No, just let me know when you spatchcock a full beef.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, well, I'm done. Zoom seemed to work fine. Michael, did you bring some people in?
No, yeah, there were several people. Jim kept popping in and out a few times. We had a few other people pop in. They were all admitted, so they were here. Yeah, it seemed to work fine, but let us know how the recording went, and when you find that, and we'll see if that worked well, and then maybe this will just be our new platform for the time being.
I do have one question. I noticed when Ken was speaking that in it highlighted the little box around the name of the person who was speaking, but his had a raised hand, like you could, like it was a notification that somebody else wanted to speak without having to necessarily interrupt to do so, that you could, and I didn't see an icon or anything where you could put that little hand up that would notify the speaker that somebody wanted to make a comment without having to interrupt first.
I was just about ready to ask, can y'all see that? I just raised my hand.